All right, skimming our way through the Old Testament, we have at various times over the past 2 or 3 months mentioned a couple of problem women. No, they're not girls that I used to date. They are Jezebel, who was married to Ahab. And they had a wonderful little daughter named Athaliah. So, Athaliah was married off to the king of the south down in Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat's son. And so Ahab and Jezebel's influence was not limited just to Israel, but to the kingdom of Judah and the south. But God is raising up, as of today, somebody who is going to put an end to these antics of the house of Ahab and Jezebel, and his name is Jehu. Jehu is the only king of the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, who even comes close to being called good. Now, he's not really a good king because Israel didn't have any good kings, but out of all of them, he was the best. That's just like Louise's son-in-law coming up to me after a sermon saying, "Jim, that's the best I've ever heard you preach. Still wasn't any good, but it's the best I ever heard you preach." Jehu wasn't any good, but he's the best king that Israel had. Okay? Now, let's back up a little ways, and Ahab is still alive, and he says to Elijah, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" These guys are not friends. And Elijah answered, "I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord." Now, why were prophets sent? Prophets were sent to warn people, you have gotten off the path. You need to get back on the path before the hammer comes down and the consequences overtake you. And this is why Elijah has found him, because he has a warning for him. And what does he say? "Behold, I will bring evil upon you." He's speaking for the Lord. "I will utterly sweep you away, and will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free." That means anybody who is related to or associated with King Ahab, they are going to die. "And I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam," who was the first king of the northern kingdom, Israel, the son of Nebat, who was an old bat, "and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, for the anger to which you have provoked me, and because you have made Israel to sin. And of Jezebel, your wife, the Lord also said, the dogs shall eat Jezebel within the bounds of Jezreel." Anybody belonging to Ahab who dies inside the city, the dogs will eat them. And anybody of his who dies out in the open country, the birds of the air shall eat. And that's just a way of saying they are not going to be buried. They are not going to have the honor of having their bodies preserved. Now, I need to explain what a dynasty is. It is not a TV program. A dynasty is, if I'm the king and my son rules in my place after I die, and his son rules in his place after he dies, that is a dynasty. Now, the northern kings of Israel had a number of dynasties. Jeroboam and his son reigned after him, and then Baasha came along and killed him. And so Baasha takes over, and he starts his own dynasty. And then Zimri comes along after Baasha's son reigns. He kills him, and he doesn't last very long, a couple months maybe, and Tibni comes along, and his son takes over. But Omri kills him, and Omri has a number of people. Ahab is his son. Ahaziah and Joram are Ahab's sons. And then Jehu comes along, and he ends that dynasty. Now, Ahab's dynasty was about 44 years. That's the second longest dynasty in all of Israel's history. But Jehu's dynasty was about 90 years. And his son Jehoahaz, his son Jehoash, his son Jeroboam, his son Zechariah, and then finally Shallum comes along, and he ends that dynasty and starts setting up his own, which doesn't last very long. In Menahem, his son Pekahiah, don't name your children Pekahiah, comes along, and Pekah destroys him, and Pekah doesn't last very long before Hoshea does him in. Not a very stable kingship in the northern kingdom. They were very evil, and they suffered the consequences of it. Now, in the southern kingdom, who's the first king? Rehoboam. Who's Rehoboam's daddy? Solomon. Who's Solomon's daddy? King David. And God kept a descendant of King David on the throne throughout all of Judah's history. You see all that long list of kings? That is one dynasty. Every single one of them can trace his ancestry back to David and forward to Jesus, okay? With one exception. Athaliah. That's Ahab's daughter, the Baal worshiper, who was married to Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram. How in the world did she get to be a leader of Judah? Well, I'm glad you asked, and we're going to get to that later in the sermon. All right. Ahaziah was 42 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. This is Jehoshaphat's grandson. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, because Ahab is his granddaddy. For his mother, that's Athaliah, was his counselor. She told him what to do. She told him how to behave. She was involved in all of his decisions. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, to make war against Hazael, king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead. And if you remember, Jehoshaphat, his granddaddy, and Ahab had joined forces to go to Ramoth Gilead to get it back from the Syrians. Did they succeed? No. So they're still after Ramoth Gilead. So a king of the south, who is Ahaziah, and his uncle, who is Jehoram, who's the king of Israel, they decided they would join forces and they would go to Ramoth Gilead. Well, guess what? They succeeded. However, the king of Israel, Jehoram, who is also called Joram, and you can see it just as plain as day, he's referred to by two names right in this passage, got wounded. And the Syrians wounded Joram, and he returned to be healed in Jezreel. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, that's a different Jehoram, went down to see Joram, who is his uncle. But it was ordained by God that the downfall of Ahaziah, who is Athaliah's son, should come about through his going to visit his uncle Joram. For when he came there, he went out with Jehoram to meet Jehu, the son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. All right? What was Jehu's purpose? To destroy the house of Ahab. Then Elisha the prophet called one of the sons of the prophets. These guys are like in seminary training to be prophets. And he said to him, gird up your loins and take this flask of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. Now let me tell you where that is. Here's the Sea of Galilee, and here is the Dead Sea. And the Jordan River comes squiggling down here. Over here on the west side is Samaria and Jezreel, which is where the capital of Israel is. Ramoth Gilead is way over here on the other side, just south of Persia, and they have just recovered that from the Persians. And guess who the general is who was in charge? Jehu. All right, so go to Ramoth Gilead, and when you arrive, look there for Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat. This is a different Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi. And go in and bid him rise from among his fellows and lead him to an inner chamber. This is going to be a private conversation. Take a flask of oil and pour it on his head and say, thus says the Lord, I am anointing you king over Israel. And then open the door and run. Don't hang around. Why? Because if some of Ahab's family discovers this, there will be a plot against Jehu, and there will be a plot against the prophet that anointed him king. So Elisha says, get out of Dodge. So the young man, the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. And when he came, behold, the commanders of the army were in council. They're already in a meeting, and a prophet gets in there to interrupt. And he said, I have an errand to you, O commander. And Jehu said, to which of us all? And he said, to you, O commander. And so he arose and went into the house, and the young man poured oil on his head and said to him, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I am anointing you king over the people of the Yahweh, over Israel. And you shall strike down the house of Ahab, your master. That means I want you to betray him. That I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of Yahweh. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel, and the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her. And then he opened the door, and he fled. So, when Joram, that's Ahab's son, he's the king up in the north right now, saw Jehu, because he and Ahaziah rode out to meet him as he was approaching Jezreel, he said, is it peace, Jehu? Now remember, this is Jehoram's general. And he was over in Ramoth Gilead to make sure that the Syrians didn't come back and retake the city. And Jehu answered, what peace can there be so long as the harlotries and the sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many? Wow, doesn't that spark hope in you that there's, maybe some godly people up in Israel? And Jehoram reined about and fled, because he's in his chariot, and he takes the reins and he pulls his horses around, and he says to Ahaziah, his nephew, who is the king of Judah, treachery, O Ahaziah, which means you got to run for your life. And Jehu drew his bow with his full strength, and he shot Joram between the shoulders, so that the arrow pierced his heart, and he sank in his chariot. And Jehu said to Bidkar, his aide, now therefore take him up, throw him on the plot of ground in accordance with the word of the Lord. Now, rather than put up another slide, just let me review with you. One of Ahab's greatest sins was that he coveted Naboth's vineyard, who lived in Jezreel. And he said to Naboth, please let me have your vineyard, and I'll pay you good money for it. And Naboth said, it'll ruin my inheritance and my son's inheritance, and so on down the line. So I can't do it. And he sulked. And of course, Jezebel gets involved and said, oh, don't worry about it. I'll get it for you. And so she forms a conspiracy. And they accused Naboth of blasphemy of the king and blasphemy of the Lord, and they took him out and stoned him on the spot, and Ahab got the vineyard. And God, through Elijah, said, on this very plot of ground, your family is going to die. And the first one to die there is Joram, in accordance with the word of the Lord. So that plot of ground that's being referred to there is Naboth's vineyard. And when Jehu was executing judgment upon the house of Ahab, see, this takes a while. He's got to kill all of Ahab's relatives, and he's not done yet. While he's doing this, he met the princes of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. That's Ahaziah's family. And the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who attended Ahaziah, and he killed them, because the Lord's got it in for Ahaziah too, because he is also under Ahab and Jezebel's influence, because his mother is Athaliah, their daughter. Are you keeping this all straight? I keep trying to repeat the relationships as I go through here to keep you up to date. So, he searched for Ahaziah, because remember, Ahaziah ran away as he shot the arrow through his uncle. So he searched for Ahaziah, and Ahaziah was captured while he was hiding in Samaria, and he was brought to Jehu, and he was put to death. They buried him. Why did they bury him? Because the curse of Ahab was not supposed to be on him. He was the grandson of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all of his heart. Look at that. These guys have an appreciation for righteousness. And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom. Why? Because Jehu had killed a bunch of the relatives who were related to the king, but that's not all. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she got up and destroyed all the rest of the royal family of the house of Judah. Wow. Thanks a lot, Grammy. Okay, so Jehu comes into Jezreel. Jezebel, who is still alive, heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head. She puts on all the makeup and all that, and looks out the window, and that doesn't charm him at all. And as Jehu entered the gate, she said, "Is it peace with you, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" And he lifted up his face to the window. He doesn't even speak to her. And he said, "Who's on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 eunuchs, servants of the king, looked down at him, and he said, "Throw her down." And so they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her. So Jehu goes in to eat and drink something, and he said, "All right, now see to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." But when they went out to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet of her, and feet and the palms of her hands. And they came back and told him, and he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel, the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the territory of Jezreel," so that nobody can even say, "This is Jezebel." Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, which is the capital. So Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the rulers of the city, to the elders and to the guardians of the sons of Ahab, saying, "Now then, as soon as this letter comes to you, seeing your master's sons are with you, and there are with you chariots and horses, fortified cities and weapons, select the best and the fittest, or the most able, of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house." But they were exceedingly afraid. So he wrote them a second letter then. He says, okay, so if you're on my side and if you're ready to obey me as the king, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me at Jezreel tomorrow at this time. Now the king's son, 70 persons were with the great men of the city who were bringing them up. And when the letter came to them, they took the king's sons, cut off their heads, slew them, 70 persons, and put their heads in baskets, and they sent them to Jezreel. Great stuff, huh? Then Jehu went into the house of Baal with Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, and he said to the worshippers of Baal, make sure that there is no servant of Yahweh here among you, but only the worshippers of Baal, because he doesn't want to get them mixed up, because he's got some devious plans for the servants of Baal. And Jehu said to the guard and to the officers, go in and slay them. Don't let a man escape. He had tricked them by pretending that he too was a Baal worshiper. So when they put them to the sword, the guards and the officers cast them out and went into the inner room of the house of Baal, and they brought out the pillar that was in the house of Baal and burned it. And they demolished the pillar of Baal and demolished the house of Baal and made it into a latrine, an outhouse to this day. And in this way, Jehu wiped out Baal worship from Israel. And all God's people said, oh, amen, this is great. Things are going to turn around for Israel. Now think about that. Let's say the Lord, just had it in for you. He destroyed all the people in your family. And then you know what he does with your house? He makes an outhouse out of it. I love it. The Bible is so great. But what happens? Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan. So even though Jehu got rid of Baal worship, and he does worship Yahweh, he worships Yahweh the wrong way. God is concerned about how we worship him. And the way that they did not worship him correctly in those days was bowing down before the golden calves that were set up at Dan in the north and Bethel in the middle. And the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit upon the throne of Israel. And that made the longest dynasty, 90 years. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had made Israel to sin. And in those days, here's the consequences, in those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. You got Judah in the south, Israel in the north. Israel in the north spans both the west side and the east side of the Jordan River. And God is going to start whittling the nation of Israel down to size. In those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. Hazael, that's the king of Syria, defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan eastward, all the land of the Gilead, the Gadites, and the Reubenites and Manassites, from Aroer, which is by the valley of the Arnon, that is Gilead, and Bashan. Now, you're wondering where that is? Take a look. You see that little blue area up there, about a third of the way down the Sea of Galilee? And you look down in a larger blue area, the Dead Sea. The body of water that connects them is the Jordan River. East of the Jordan River, you see where the tribes of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben had settled? Well, guess what? That is no longer part of Israel. God has given that to Israel's enemies, just as he promised back in Deuteronomy that he would do if they did not follow him and walk according to his ways. And folks, God will start taking away people and possessions away from us if we do not walk according to his ways. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead because Jehu had killed him, she got up and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. Now, this doesn't make any sense, because God had promised King David that there would not be a man on the throne that was not descended from him. And this was Satan's desire, to cut off the house of David so that God could not complete this promise. And Satan knew that the Christ had to come from the house of David. But if you cut off all of David's relatives and it can't go on, then God can't complete his promise. But God has always got servants in the strangest places. But Jehoshabeth, don't name your daughter Jehoshabeth, the daughter of the king, not King Ahaziah, but King Ahaziah's father Jehoram, who was Jehoshaphat's son. That means he's in the lineage of David. Jehoshabeth, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, the king that has just died, and stole him away from the king's sons who were about to be put to death. And she put him and his nurse in a bedchamber in her own house. Thus Jehoshabeth, the daughter of King Jehoram. Was King Jehoram a good king? No. Was his son Ahaziah a good king? No. Who is Jehoshabeth's mother? Athaliah. Is she a good person? No. But who did Jehoshabeth marry? Jehoiada, the priest. She is the wife of Jehoiada the priest, and she was the sister of Ahaziah in the north, and she hid him from Ahaziah in the south. And she hid him from the evil Athaliah, so that she did not slay him. And he remained with them 6 years, hidden in the house of God, because that's where the high priest lived, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So if you're wondering how Athaliah gets on that list over there as a ruler of Judah, that's how it happened. And nobody dared defy her. And so for about 6 or 7 years, she was in charge. But in the 7th year, the godly Jehoiada, who is the high priest, sent and brought the captains of the Kerites, or the executioners, and of the guards, and had them come to him in the house of the Lord, that's the temple. And he made a covenant with them and put them under oath in the house of the Lord. Guys, can you keep a secret? Promise me you can keep a secret. And what did he do? Out from behind his back, he showed them the king's son. How old is this boy? He is 7 years old. And the priest delivered to the captains the spears and the shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. And the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, round the altar of the house. And then he brought out the king's son, and he put the crown upon him, and gave him the testimony. What's that? That's the book of the law that Moses wrote. And he put the crown upon him, gave him the testimony, and they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." And there he is. Isn't he a doll? 7 years old, and he is king of Judah. And he is a descendant of David. And neither Athaliah nor Satan was able to disrupt God's plan to bring the Messiah as a descendant of King David. Got pretty close there for a while. When Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar, according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Yay! And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason! Treason!" Well, they've got a different idea of what treason is now. Treason is treason against the Lord, not against you, Athaliah. And Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, bring her out between the ranks and slay her with the sword, slay with the sword anybody else who follows her. For the priest said, let her not be slain in the house of the Lord. So they laid hands on her, and she went through the horse's entrance to the king's house, and there she was slain. God can raise you up to do something wonderful for his kingdom and make you great. But if you don't continue in his ways with a whole heart, it can come crashing down upon you. And this is what happened with Jehu. Jehu did a diligent and wonderful job of destroying the house of Ahab and his influence in Israel and ridding the country of Baal worship. But instead of continuing on with the Lord's ways and the Lord's word, he corrupted his worship of God, and it all came crashing down upon him. In those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. Folks, if you've done something wonderful and great for God, don't just sit back in your rocking chair and reminisce. Continue to grow in the Lord Christ. Walk in his ways. Walk in his word. Walk in his will, or God will start cutting blessing and territory off from your life. The Lord said to Jehu, because you did well, you're going to get a big long dynasty to the 4th generation. Your failure to give God the devotion he deserves will result both in disaster for you and for your children. What about Ahab? Ahab just kept doing worse and worse things. It resulted in disaster for Ahab. He was killed in battle, trying to retake territory that belonged to Israel. His children and his grandchildren and his nieces and his nephews, his wife and his daughter were killed because of it. Your failure to give God the devotion he deserves doesn't affect just you. It will affect the generations that follow you. The whole house of Ahab shall perish, God said, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she got up and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. Sometimes, folks, the people that suffer from your failure to follow the Lord are innocent victims, as it was in this case, because Athaliah was let live and to be an influence in the house of God, and she ended up destroying good people. The people in your life who are most important to you will influence you for good or for evil. Was Jehoshaphat a good king? He was one of the best. But he made an alliance with King Ahab, and he made some pretty awful mistakes because of that. The people in your life who are most important to you will influence you for good or for evil. Ahaziah was 42 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, and he walked in the ways of the house of Ahab. Why? Because of the influence in his life. His mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. The people in your life who are most important to you will influence you for good or for evil. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she rose and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. But Jehoshabeth, who is the daughter of an evil king, who is the granddaughter of an evil king, and she's got another grandfather who is an evil king, and a grandmother who is an evil person, and she has a mother, Athaliah, who is an evil person. This girl doesn't have a chance. But God brings a godly influence into her life, who is Jehoiada, her husband, who is the priest. And Jehoshabeth shall be remembered for all eternity for being used by the Lord to save the lineage of David, so that we would have a Messiah. Because the people in your life who are most important to you will influence you for good or for evil. Now, friends, does this mean that we avoid evil people? No. But if they are the most important people in your life, and they are the ones that influence your perspective on life, your perspective of Jesus Christ and his requirements of you, if they determine your ethics and your morals, then you are going to go their way. Because the people in your life who are most important to you will influence you for good or for evil. But as Paul says, when I told you not to hang around with immoral people, I did not mean the immoral of the world. Since then, you would need to go out of the world. And if you don't hang around with those people, how are they going to see the Christ in us? But folks, the problem is when we hang around with them, do they see the Christ in us? And that's the issue. The people in life who are most important to you will influence you for good or for evil.